kind of a provocative title. The talk basically how the Roman Catholic Church handles money and how much money is handled by the Roman Catholic Church. To give us a sense, my hope is that when you go home tonight, you'll have a better understanding of the structure of the church and exactly how and who's responsible for the handling of money. It's not something we talk about very, very often, and it's something that's not well understood by a lot of people. And I gave the talk after having met, I was doing one of my parish visitations, because this year I'm visiting parishes across the diocese. And I met with one of the finance councils, and we were talking about some issues, and they brought up some questions, and as I was answering this, they were saying, we never knew this. We never understood this. Then one of them says, you know, your talks you give, your public talks, you should give one night on this topic, you know? And so that's how I decided, okay, I'll give a talk on money and the church and how it's organized. And you might have some questions, so jot them down, and as we go along, if at one point I can answer them, I will. Now, the first thing I have to do here is tell you that I am not an expert in financial affairs, okay? I can discuss theology much more than I can discuss balance sheets. I'm coming to this from a real layman's point of view in terms of not being a specialist in financial issues. I have difficulty understanding the difference between stocks and bonds. All right, so bear with me if I don't have all the answers, but I see that Gordy Bryan is sitting with us, and and everybody knows Gordy. Gordy was administrator for the diocese for many years, and he has all the answers that I won't have, so you can ask him as we go along. But at least I have a good understanding of the structure of the church, how it's organized, and I'll try to respond to those issues and try to clarify that as much as possible. I'd like to start with a story, and this is a true story. I was called to the Cornwall Inquiry to give what is known as a presentation of corporate structure. They wanted to know all the institutions that are being studied. They wanted to know how these institutions are structured, who's responsible for what. So I went, this is 2 years ago already now, I went and I spent 2 days answering questions from the various lawyers who were there, explaining how the Catholic Church is structured. And one of the lawyers came up to me afterwards and says, you know, that was the most interesting day we've had up to now. I've learned so much. And he says, and I'm a Catholic. So that's the first story. So here was a lawyer who specialized, you know, in the field of law, who didn't know how the church was structured. So it was a revelation for him. Second little story I want to tell, dealing with the inquiry again. As the inquiry was starting, different groups were invited to petition the commissioner for standing, and if they chose, for funding. Standing meant that you had the right to have a lawyer there representing you or your institution and representing your interests and asking questions and everything. So we asked for standing, and we got standing. That's fine. Then we asked for funding. Funding is basically asking the government of Ontario to pay for our lawyer to be there. And the general rule is that those who can't pay for it, the province will pay. So when we applied for funding, and it's the commissioner that makes the decision, you know, whether to recommend to the government to pay for this or not. So when we applied for it, we were refused funding. And the commissioner's rule was very kind of straightforward. He says, well, you don't need money. All you have to do is write Rome, and they'll send you the money you need. Now, the commissioner's an intelligent man. I mean, he's the head judge of the provincial court up in Northern Ontario. He's been entrusted with important responsibilities. He's an intelligent man, but he has obviously no understanding at all of how the church is organized. And so we told him, look, can you give us a couple of weeks and we'll show you how wrong you are about this? And he said, okay, I'll give you 2 weeks. And so during the following 2 weeks, our lawyers put together a whole presentation on how the church is structured financially to show him that the Diocese of Alexandria Cornwall is completely independent and completely responsible for its own financial affairs and cannot get any money for any outside source. And here's how much money we have, and with the money we have, we cannot fund a lawyer to be present at this inquiry day after day for however long it lasts. And when he saw it, he said, I'm sorry, He says, I was really mistaken. I was basing my thought on popular misconceptions, and so I grant you the funding that you need. And so that popular misconception that somehow Rome is sitting in the midst of all this gold and can kind of dish it out to any bishop who calls Rome, for any needs that are in the church, that's a popular misconception. So tonight, I would like you to be freed from those popular misconceptions and have a better sense of how it's organized, okay? So maybe the first thing to explain is that the Roman Catholic Church in the world is organized in a number of discrete, independent entities. Let's talk about the dioceses first of all. In the world, there are about 2,000 dioceses. That's the number of dioceses there are in the world. In Canada, there are about 65 or 70 dioceses. Each diocese is completely independent financially. Each diocese is responsible for raising its own money, meeting its own needs, and if they get into trouble, they got to get out of trouble alone. Surrounding issues of clergy sexual abuse. They've had to declare bankruptcy because when you're at the end and there's no more money in the coffers to pay out settlements, there's no more money. And so you have to declare bankruptcy. Each diocese is completely independent. And that's something that is very hard for people in the legal field in Canada to understand. Many lawyers, many prosecutors have tried to say, well, the Catholic Church is the Catholic Church in Canada, and so we should be responsible here in Cornwall for what somebody in Toronto did, for example. And we keep on saying, no, that's not true. Each diocese is completely independent. In Canada, each diocese is incorporated by an act of their provincial parliament. Generally, the provincial parliament incorporates. And our act of incorporation goes back to the founding of the diocese in 1890. That act of incorporation establishes the diocese. Now, dioceses in the world are established in different ways as corporations, depending on the law of the land. The law in France will be different from the law in Europe, in Italy will be different from the law in Canada, will be different from the law in Japan. Each country has its own laws. So a diocese has to be structured according to the laws of the country where it is. So in Canada, the dioceses are structured in nearly all of Canada except Quebec, and a couple of places, I think the Diocese of Winnipeg isn't structured that way, but all the other dioceses are structured as what is called corporation souls. So corporation soul, not soul S-O-U-L, like the soul, the body and the soul, but soul S-O-L-E, which means only. A corporation with only one member in the corporation. See, most corporations have members in the corporation, right? You have a membership, the members elect a board of directors, the board of directors runs the corporation. Do you understand what I'm saying here? That's the typical way that most corporations are set up. And you belong to the corporation either through buying shares or through signing up and paying registration fees or whatever, but that's how corporations are set up. The Catholic dioceses are set up as corporation sole, meaning there is only one member of the corporation. And the member of the corporation is the bishop. He's the only member of the civil corporation. So the corporation of the diocese, the Episcopal Corporation of the Diocese of Alexandria, Cornwall, that's the name, has one member, me. That's it. And all the properties and all the financial responsibilities that accrue to a diocese all belong to that corporation that only has one member. That's how the dioceses are organized in Canada. So all the churches in Cornwall, all the cemeteries in Cornwall, they all belong to the corporation of the Diocese of Alexandria, Cornwall. And there's only one member of the corporation, me. I don't own it, it's the diocese that owns it, but there's only one member to the corporation. So there's only one person who can sign, though there are other signing officers. I assign other signing officers, but my signature has to be on any sale of land, on any sale of a building, on any major issue we enter into contracts, etc. It's a way of corresponding to the responsibility of the bishop within a diocese to administer the diocese. So that way, at the level of the law of Ontario, then, I can make any decision I want in regards to the functioning of the diocese in terms of its ownership and its responsibilities before the law. Not in terms of church law, though. Church law, canon law, has a number of rules and regulations that I must follow, including respecting the identity of parishes. So parishes, for church law, are individual realities. And each parish is responsible for church law to raise its own money and to function as an independent organization. So within the corporation of the Diocese of Alexandria, Cornwall, we identify each parish as individually run, and we identify each one as having its own account with the diocese. And whenever we deal with organizations outside the diocese, we deal on behalf of the parish. So that if a parish, for example, is sued, actually a parish can't be sued because the parish doesn't exist in civil law. Only the diocese exists. So it's the diocese that is sued. A parish can't go into debt. Only the diocese can go into debt. A parish can't own property. Only the diocese can own property. But we do it on behalf of the diocese. So one of the consequences of that, for example, is when a parish saves money in its functioning, that money is invested by the diocese on behalf of the parish. See? So let's say a parish has managed to raise over the year $100,000. That $100,000 is invested by the diocese under an account under the name of the diocese, because only the diocese exists in civil law, but it's done on behalf of the parish. So whenever the parish needs that money, they have access to it. That's the way the dioceses in Canada function. I'll show you in a moment the balance sheet of the Diocese of Alexandria, Cornwall, and you'll see what is identified as what belongs to the parishes. It doesn't belong to the parishes in civil law, because in civil law, parishes have no standing, no juridic personality, as we say. But in church law, they do. And so according to church law, then, I have to respect that. All right? So that's the way the dioceses are structured, except I said in Quebec. In Quebec, they have this thing called la loi de la fabrique. A fabrique is an old French word that kind of speaks about, well, I guess if you had a farm, and on the farm you have the house and you have the barn and you have some sheds, that would be called, the French would call that la fabrique. The whole kind of, throw that all in the pot, all the buildings together and the land, and that's the fabrique of this farm, all right? So they have la loi de la fabrique, and each parish is identified as a separate and standalone fabrique on its own. So they have to have, each fabrique has to have a board of directors. And their board of directors are the members of what we would call the finance council of the parish. But the finance council has to be elected by the members of the parish. See, they're structured like a real corporation, with the members of the parish electing their board members, and the board members then becoming le conseil de fabrique. And they have that beautiful, les marguilliers. The marguilliers, the members of the conseil de fabrique are called marguilliers. The parish priest is de facto the chair of the conseil de fabrique, but he doesn't have power, he doesn't have veto power, anything over the conseil de fabrique. So there's a real, how can you say, empowerment of the lay people in that structure, in the sense that it really is the body of those who represent the parishioners who must administer the goods of the parish. So the diocese in Quebec does not own the parishes. The diocese does not own the land. It's the parishes that own it. Which is why, for example, closing a parish in Quebec is much harder than closing a parish in Ontario. Because if we decide that we need to close a parish, since the parish belongs to the diocese, ultimately, though the bishop wants to do it with the parishioners as much as possible. Ultimately, he has the final word. Whereas in Quebec, the Conseil de Fabrique can just tell the bishop, you know where you can go. We're going to hold on to our property. So the bishop says, well, if you do that, I won't send you a priest. And they say, well, that's fine, don't send us a priest. And so there have been some very serious conflicts between some parishes and some bishops in Quebec because of the incorporation of the parishes individually. Now, I want to tell you a little story of a little-known history of the church in Canada. The first bishop of Toronto, his name was Michael Power. Michael Power had been a young boy, Irish lad who had grown up in Halifax. And at the time, there was only one diocese for Canada, which was in Quebec. So he went to Quebec. He went actually to minor seminary in Montreal, and he learned French. And eventually, here was this kind of Irish guy who spoke beautiful French. And so the bishop decided not to send him back to Halifax, but to keep him in the Montreal area to work in these parishes that were kind of bilingual. So he was sent to Drummondville to start with in the Eastern Townships, when the Eastern Townships were opening up. But at that time, things were not very well organized, you know. Anyway, he spent some years in Drummondville. And then he ended up as parish priest in Montebello. And he used to have to come to Grenville and L'Orignal to celebrate Mass there for the people in winter. He would walk there from Montebello in the winter to go celebrate Mass, then walk back. There's a wonderful story he writes to his bishop saying, look, there's no heat, the windows are broken at the church in Grenville, the wine freezes in the chalice. I have to have a little stove going on the altar so that my fingers don't freeze up. Do you think we could kind of cancel Mass for the winter time here and I'll come during the summer? Anyway, so that's the kind of situations he faced. And then he ended up as parish priest in Châteauguay. And then he was chosen as the first bishop of Toronto. He had had so much trouble with the Marguillers, you know, these parish councils in Drummondville and in Montebello and in Châteauguay, that when he got bishop in Toronto, he went to see the governor of Ontario, and he said, we have to incorporate the diocese, but I do not want the parishes to be incorporated. I want everything to be incorporated under the name of diocese, and I will be the sole member of this corporation. And the governor said, that sounds good to me. And that's how the first corporation sole in the world was built up. And a friend of his had just been named bishop of New York, the new diocese of New York. So he wrote to his friend and said, get yourself structured as a corporation sole. It's the best thing going. So the Bishop of New York did it. And it spread around all the states and all of Canada. And that's how, except in Quebec, there are corporation soles. It's all just because of Bishop Power, who had had a rough time with his Marguillers in Drummondville and Montebello. And so that's the history. But that's how the dioceses are incorporated sole. And let me then give you the balance sheet of our diocese, so it'll give you an idea of what we're talking about in financial terms. While I'm passing this out, are there any questions on these issues up to now? What year was Bishop Power? I think it was around 1830, if I'm not mistaken. Oh, 1842. Merci. 1840. There you go. Merci, Sébastien. Une chance, t'es là. Comment tu sais ça? T'as une meilleure mémoire que moi. So how was the structure organized? Again, it would depend on the country, and I don't know enough about, you know, the history of the Middle Ages. At the Reformation in England, I know this, 1/3 of the land of England was owned by religious orders. 1/3 of the whole land of England was owned by religious orders. How's that? Not by the Vatican, by religious orders, like the Benedictines and the Dominicans and the Franciscans. They owned 1/3 of all the land in England, which was one of the reasons that Henry VIII decided to abolish all religious orders, was to be able to hand the land to his lords. Well, there was some of that too. It becomes a very complicated issue, the whole issue in England. So the question here is religious orders. Religious orders are completely independent from dioceses. Okay? So, for example, in our diocese, we have, Father Cyprian is here. And Father Cyprian belongs to the order of the Sons of Mary, Mother of Mercy, which is a religious order that was founded in Nigeria. And so as a religious order, how many priests in your order, Cyprian? 72 priests, and they have about 100 seminarians. 200 seminarians. So they're growing. They're a young order, but they're growing. Well, his seminary and his staff and everything, they are completely independent. Now, he is working for us, so he gets a salary from us, but he doesn't own the parish where he's working. That parish is our parish, okay? Now, it does happen that in some places a religious order has built a sanctuary of their own, a monastery of their own, with a church of their own. Usually those do not become parishes. What happens usually is people just end up going there. That could belong to the religious order, certain churches or things like that. Montreal is a case in point. The Sulpicians own La Basilique Notre-Dame in Montreal. It does not belong to the diocese. It is structured as a parish so that there is a Conseil de Fabrique. That's right. It used to belong. That's right. I just remember this. It used to belong to the Sulpicians. The Sulpicians gave it over to a Conseil de Fabrique a number of years ago. I can't remember how many. They also own, the Fabrique owns le cimetière de la Côte des Neiges, where they've had a strike for the past few years, with the workers, and they protest against the Sulpician fathers, but it's not the Sulpicians that own it, it's the parish that owns it. The Conseil de Fabrique owns it, So it gets complicated. You get into how can you say, then you get into relationships between contracts and everything. But the fundamental rule is that religious orders are independent from the dioceses. The dioceses function independently from them, okay? So if you take a look at this balance sheet, this is last year's balance sheet for the year that's just ended at 2007. So if you look at it, you'll see that under current assets, you'll see cash, bank account, and I don't know what all of this means, but you've got $366,000 under cash assets. Then you have things like personal loans and total receivables and GST paid on purchases and things like that. So that our total current assets liquid are $499,761. That's $500,000 of liquid assets in the diocese. Other assets, there are some loans to priests and seminarians, loans to parishes. Some parishes have borrowed money from the diocese. For example, Chrysler renovated their whole church a number of years ago. They've been paying off, their debt to the diocese, but they don't owe the whole $80,000, but they're one of the few parishes. We don't have many parishes that owe money to the diocese. Then mortgages receivable at Thy Word Ministries. When we sold Christ Roi Church to At Thy Word Ministries, they said, we'll buy it from you, but we don't have enough money. Would you lend us the money so we can buy it from you? So that's what we did. So we lent them money, and so they're paying the money back. So we hold their mortgage, things like that. The Friends of St. Raphael's, the ruins of St. Raphael's, we loaned them a certain amount of money to fix the ruins. So they still owe us, what's written there, $68,000. So the total of loans and mortgages receivable is $277,000. We loaned $100,000 to the Agape Center to restructure and renovate the Agape Center, and they will be paying that back to us as they receive their subvention, the government grants and things like that, and their fundraising, so that will be coming back to us. We have short-term investments of $207,000, and then the big number in all of this is long-term investments of $6,600,000. Okay, so that's $6,600,000. That's our big, how can you say, package of stuff that we've got invested, mostly in bonds and debentures. So the total investment is $6 million. So when you bring all the totals together, our assets are $7,200,000, which sounds like a big number when you're just an individual. Like I will never have $7 million in the bank, right? But when you're a corporation and when you're dealing with numbers like this, you realize that 7 million isn't really a very, very big number for a corporation of this size. And what I want to show you is if you shift to the next page right away, and you see the first big title there that's called long-term debt, deposits from parishes, 4,390,000. That's the money that belongs to the parishes that the parishes have entrusted to the diocese to be invested. So when you see the number of the diocese that says 6,870,000, well, of that 6,600,000, 4,300,000 is the parish's money. So that only leaves about 2 million something that is actually of the diocese. And if you go down that second page, due to trust funds, much of that money is kind of identified under certain trust funds, the Bishop Larocque Vocation Fund, the Reverend Bruno Pilon Fund, the Continuing Education Fund, the Reverend O'Brien Fund, the St. Finnan Vocation Fund, the Centennial Pastoral Fund. These are all funds that were established by different groups at different moments for specific purposes. The funds are placed at the diocese and the diocese disperses the money according to the description of the funds. So I won't go more into that. This is our, it's unaudited yet. We have to get this audited. So in a couple of months, we'll have the audited figures, but these are the first figures. So it gives you an idea of how much money is in the Diocese of Alexandria, Cornwall. Now, listed in here are not the values. If you look under capital assets on the first page, about halfway down, you see capital assets. Okay, you see that? So it says building 220 Montreal Road. That's our office on Montreal Road. Underneath, accrued depreciation of $86,000. So, and then the building at 1800 Montreal Road, that was the old bishop's residence. We don't have that anymore. It's just entered there as an entrance for comparison's sake. Bishop's residence here, this house is evaluated at $121,000. Iona Academy, the old bishop's residence in St. Raffles at 67, but with a $42,000 depreciation. The Marguerite Bourgeois Center here is 61,000. The sisters' residence at Shalom in St. Raffles, 127,000. So the net book value of our buildings that the diocese owns independently from the parish buildings is 275,000, about $250,000 of the things that the diocese owns. Now, the parishes are independently valued, and they're valued at basically for insurance purposes at cost replacement. So how much would it cost to replace this building? But the market value is not the same as the replacement value. For example, Saint Jean Bosco, which probably has a replacement value of about $3 million, $2.5 million. The market value was $200,000, a tenth of it. Because who's going to buy, a $2 million church? There's no market for it. So the market value and the book value and the market value are two different things completely when you get into things like that. You had that was the question. Yeah, depreciated because of. Well, I'm not sure how depreciation works. A lot of this is bookkeeping rules, A lot of this is bookkeeping rules. You'd have to. Do you have an answer to that, Gordy? Or
122, and why do you take off the depreciation? Is that what you say you get? 40, 30, 40,000.
It's in terms of the it's in terms of the book value. I don't know how much we would get if we set it up for sale. Yeah. Do you know what the depreciation? What the accrued depreciation?
Determine what the value of the building is for resale.
So
the bishop said sometimes you get a shock when you find out it's not going to be worth half of what you
that it would be worth and things like that. So at any rate, that covers the Diocese of Alexandria, Cornwall. Is that okay? Does that give you a good idea, Don? Good question. I don't know. Yeah, I'm not sure. Yes. The belongings of the parishes are not listed in that statement.
What is the reasoning since, as you mentioned, all the churches directly belong
To the diocese. The reason it's not in our the reason it's not in our balance sheet. It's in our what do they call it? Statement of assets and statement of assets for the diocese. There's another sheet. I've just given you the balance sheet. The buildings are insured independently, and the parishes are responsible for the insurance of each of their buildings. So that could be one reason why les comptables, the accountants, there are accountants' rules that I don't understand that say we put them here, we don't put them there, and things like that. I can't answer that. Okay.
we also have the annexes, bishops.
When we present this, because every year we present this to the parish finance councils, there are a series of annexes that we add to this report that give all those informations. There's also, what's not listed here is the statement of balance, for example, for the cemeteries that we own. Because the diocese runs the cemeteries of St. Columban, Notre Dame, and Nativité cemeteries, as well as the little cemetery at Old Hotel Dieu Hospital. So that's not there either. That's another reality. But it's just, the reason I give it to you is just to give you a kind of a global idea of what diocesan finances look like, all right? Now, you can set that aside for now if you want. So where does the Vatican fit into this, right? Where does the Vatican fit into this? The Vatican is a very complicated structure. More complicated than I can understand. But basically what you have to get into your minds is that in Rome, when you go to the Vatican, there are two separate legal realities there. There's the city of the Vatican, which is a state, and there's the Holy See, which is the administration of the Roman Catholic Church in the world. All right? The Pope's salary does not come from the city of the Vatican, it comes from the Holy See. Okay? The janitor's salary comes from the city of the Vatican. It's a complicated structure, but basically what you have to think is that in Rome, you have a state called the City of the Vatican, which supports a worldwide organization called the Roman Catholic Church. And let me try to describe what goes under the title Holy See. The Holy See basically is the Pope's ministry to the worldwide church and the people who support him. So what does the Pope have? The Pope has 2,674 employees working for him in Rome. 2,600 employees. That's it. It's like it's not a huge business, right? That's it. That's the number of people who work for the Pope in Rome. What do? Some of them work for the Secretariat of State, which basically, one part of the Secretariat of State makes sure that all the people get along together in Rome who work for the Pope, and the other section works for relationships with international bodies and with other governments, the Secretariat of State. Then there are 9 congregations. You've heard, for example, the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, which was the congregation that our Pope, present Pope, used to be the head of. Congregations are kind of departments. You can think of them as ministries within the government, each one dealing with a special area of church life. There's a congregation for bishops, there's a congregation for priests, there's a congregation for religious, there's a congregation for Catholic education, there's a congregation for liturgy and the sacraments. There are 9 congregations in all. And for example, it's the congregation of bishops whose job is to advise the Pope on who should be named bishop to Alexandria, Cornwall. So at one point, my name went to the Congregation of Bishops, and they studied my dossier, and they sent it up to the Pope with, I hope, a good recommendation, because here I am. So the congregations, there are 3 tribunals. There are 11 pontifical councils. Councils are like congregations, but smaller, less important. There's a pontifical council for culture. There's a council for refugees. There's a council for justice and peace. There's a council for the interpretation of law. There's a council. It is a council, Sebastian? There's a council for ecumenism. There's a council for interreligious dialogue. I'm looking at Sebastian. A lot of people don't know Sebastian. Sebastian Grolot, who's at the back, who's going to be all shy because I introduce him. Sebastian is a priest of the Diocese of Hearst, who has just completed his licentiate in canon law at Ottawa, at St. Paul's University. So he knows the answer to all these questions, you see. And Sébastien is helping us out in the diocese by replacing Father Eric Robichaud in Glenn Robertson. Father Eric is studying in Boston right now, so Father Sébastien is with us for the year. The Pope also has the administration of the patrimony of the Holy See, which is basically responsible for administrating the 118 embassies that the Vatican has around the world. We call them nunciatures. But if you go to Ottawa, in Rockcliffe Park, there's an incredible building there that the Canadian bishops at one point bought and gave to Rome so that it would be the embassy of the Pope in Canada. The nuncio, or the ambassador to Canada, is a bishop. It's always a bishop. The nuncios are always bishops. It is Bishop Luigi Ventura is our nuncio here, the ambassador of the Vatican to Canada. And at the same time, he coordinates communication between the bishops of Canada and Rome. If I want to write to the Pope, I don't send a letter to the Pope. I send it to the nuncio. He puts it in the diplomatic pouch. It goes straight to Rome. It's open there, and then it goes to the Pope's desk, you know. So we deal with the nunciatures. Well, there are 118 of those around the world. That's part of the Holy See, okay? The prefecture of the Pontifical House, the office for pontifical liturgical celebrations. You know, when the Pope celebrates Mass, it takes more than 2 altar boys, you know, because when he celebrates Mass out on the piazza, you know, they have to set up 20,000 chairs the day before and then take down the 20,000 chairs. So there's got to be a few dozen people there whose jobs are just setting up the chairs and taking them down. And then the master of ceremonies and the choirs and, you know, all sorts of people are involved. There's the press office of the Holy See, the Vatican Information Service, the Central Office for the Statistics of the Church. There are 5 pontifical commissions and committees. There are 9 institutions that are related to the Holy See. The archives, the library, Radio Vatican, the newspaper, L'Osservatore Romano, the typography, the editing house, the TV center, the papal charities. Papal charities is kind of the Pope's kitty. People send, the people often give donations to the Pope. The Pope puts that in his kitty, papal charities, and when there's a disaster somewhere in the world, he sends that money directly there. So that it's a way of getting money quickly to places that are in very, very dire circumstances. It's kind of the Pope's good works. It's called the papal charities. There's also, and under the Holy See, there's also the Fabrique of St. Peter's Basilica itself, which is, I mean, somebody has to take care of that huge basilica. Its upkeep and everything, all of that goes under the Holy See. The Synod of Bishops, the 6 pontifical academies, and the 118 political representations of the Pope vis-a-vis the United Nations and affiliated organizations. The Holy See is not a member of the United Nations, but they have a standing as permanent observer. It's a unique standing. They didn't want to be listed as a country, but they wanted to participate. So they don't have the right to vote, but they have the right to be involved in discussions and in representations and trying to establish policy and everything. And actually, the Vatican, because it's one of the countries that has the most diplomatic relationships with countries in the world, is kind of a hub of political activity in the world. So all of that falls under the Holy See. How many employees did I say to run all of that? 2,600, okay? So what does it cost to run the Holy See? It costs about $250 million a year. That's what it costs, $250 million a year. You can compare that, you say 250 million, that's a lot, but to run the city of Toronto, the municipal government of Toronto, the annual budget there is $8 billion a year. You know, so 250 million compared to $8 billion, you know, it's a complete different order of scale. So basically, the Vatican runs on a tight budget with very few personnel. Some of the offices in Rome, for example, you know, we're having the Eucharistic Congress here in Quebec City. We have 70 employees organizing the Eucharistic Congress right now in Quebec City. There's an office for Eucharistic Congresses in Rome that coordinates, you know, that office will kind of make sure who's going to hold the next Eucharistic Congress. They kind of vet the various documents. They're kind of the reference office for all Eucharistic Congresses in the world. Do you know how many employees they have? One. There's one person in Rome that works on the office for Eucharistic Congresses. So it just gives you an idea of how it's organized there. That's why sometimes things are very slow when you deal with the Vatican. You try to avoid that as much as possible. The money comes from three sources. Where did they get the 250 million? First of all, contributions. They get contributions from bishops' conferences, from dioceses, from religious orders, from individual lay donors like yourself who send money to the Vatican. For 2004, they received $90 million in donations this way. 90 million. Of this amount, about close to 30 million came from individual dioceses, because there's a new code of canon law that says that dioceses have to support the Vatican. It doesn't say how much, but it says we have a responsibility to. So last year, when I went to my ad limina visit, every 5 years as a bishop, I go to Rome, I brought a check with me on behalf of the people of the Diocese of Alexandria, Cornwall. I gave it to the Pope. It wasn't very much because we're not a big diocese, but I gave it as a contribution to the working of the Vatican. So the Holy See receives about $30 million every year, which comes out to an average of about $10,000 per diocese that is given, all right? The second source of revenue are earnings on real estate. In 1929, this is a complicated story, but in 1929, the government of Italy signed an agreement with the Holy See. What had happened, see, is that up until about 1870, Rome was the capital of a country called the Papal States, and the Papal States were quite extensive. They covered about a fifth of the area of present-day Italy, and the Pope was kind of king of those Papal States. When there were movements started in Italy to unify the country under one king, they conquered the Papal States. And the Pope went and hid in the Vatican. And all of a sudden, you know, they had kind of an important landmass. They didn't have anything anymore. And all that land and all those buildings were taken from the Papal States without any compensation. That was done in about 1870. And that remained a bone of contention between the Pope and the government of Italy up until 1927, when finally an agreement came into being. And the agreement recognized Vatican City as an independent state and gave compensation. And the compensation includes about 30 buildings, you know, 1,700 apartments, a number of farms out in the countryside. And these buildings and apartments and farms produced a revenue of 64 million last year for Rome, okay, for the Vatican. So they got 30 million in donations, 60 million from the revenue from this patrimony that was given to them by Italy in 1927. And finally, earnings from investments and other financial activities within the Vatican's portfolio, which is divided 80% bonds, 20% stocks. In 2004, earnings were about the range of 100 million. The statement noted that the sector showed an improvement of 25 million vis-a-vis the situation in 2004. Actually, before the previous year, actually the Vatican, the Holy See was running in the red for the past number of years. It's only been about 3 years now that they're in the black, that they're making ends meet, you could say, in Rome, okay? So that's, and just in passing, papal charities, that's money that goes in, goes out, right? That about 50 million comes into the Pope and goes out for relief aid every year from the Pope's office, just in passing. So that's the Holy See. Now, I said there's another reality, which is the city of the Vatican. The city of the Vatican is the actual city, the running of the city with the buildings and the gardens and the police department and the fire department and the grocery store and the bank, and it's a little town in there. So they have 1,500 employees, 1,500. They have 920 inhabitants. 920 people actually live in the Vatican, of which the Pope is one. The official language of the city of the Vatican, just for your interest, is Italian. No, that's not. The official language is Latin. The working language is Italian. The diplomatic language, French. And the official language of the Swiss Guard? German. So there you go. Anyway, so the Vatican itself, the Vatican City States, includes the museum. You know, the Museum of the Vatican? So it includes the museum. And actually, the revenues, this is going back to 2003, so 5 years ago, these are the latest figures I have. The Vatican City's revenues was about 200 million. And most of that came from the entrance fees that are paid by people who go and visit the museums. And they had a little deficit because they gave money to the Holy See to cover the deficit of Vatican radio. I've been talking with, the Pope has a committee to study all these issues, and Cardinal Turcotte was on that committee, and I was asking him about, the functioning of the Vatican. He says, there's one thing that is always in a deficit, and it's Radio Vatican. He says, but it's run by the Jesuits, so you can't touch it. Anyway, I'd just like to point out that, okay, so what is the Vatican's net worth, in terms of the buildings it has and the farms it owns and the money it has placed? The Vatican's net worth is approximately $1 billion. I told you Toronto's operating budget is $8 billion, all right? So the whole Vatican, its net worth is about $1 billion. The endowment fund of Notre Dame University in the States is $3 billion. It just gives you an example. So is the church rich? Is the Vatican rich? When you look at the figure 1 billion, you say, oh my God, yeah. But when you compare it to other institutions, like most of the major universities in the United States have a larger endowment fund than the Vatican does in its total worth. But there is one question, and that is, in this picture, we don't include the worth of the artworks that are in the museum at the Vatican and in St. Peter's of Rome. We don't include the artworks. The artworks are not included. They're given of a sum, I think, for accounting purposes of $1. Because the artworks are priceless, in the strongest sense of the word. They are without price. I've been thinking a lot since I started, thinking about this talk that I was giving. People say, well, why doesn't the Pope sell Michelangelo's Pietà? He could get, 10 million for it, and then he could help, the poor people of Africa. And you hear that sometimes, Why don't they sell all those artworks? But the whole notion of art being for sale is a very strange notion. I went to listen the other day to Saint-Saëns' Third Symphony in Boston. I was in Boston, and I went to the symphony. Now, I paid for the performance because basically I'm paying for the orchestra players to perform it so that I can hear it. But does the orchestra own the piece of music? No. Who owns the piece of music? Nobody owns the piece of music. Companies have copyright on the sheet music, and you'll have to pay to get the sheet music. Somebody who performs the work might have copyright on that performance, so you can't just download the performance, then use it for your own ends. So they're copyrights. But the work of art itself doesn't belong to anybody. It's a work of art. It's created for humanity. You know, a play doesn't belong to someone. It's a work of art. It's only paintings and sculpture that we've assigned numbers to because people trade in them. And that's been fairly recent, that people should trade on works of art. And the question is this legitimate even? When a work of art was made for the glory of God, when you read Michelangelo's biography, you see the love that he put into that statue that he was making for the glory of God, to be in a church so that people could come in and be touched and moved by it and realize what a sacrifice Jesus made when he died on the cross and how Mary was associated to that sacrifice. That's why he made it. Should we sell that? Should we put a dollar figure on it? Rome refuses to put a dollar figure on it. They don't want it ending up in some person's living room where he can shut the doors and say, nobody can see it except me because I've got enough money to keep it to myself. So they leave it out there so anybody can see. Michelangelo's Pietà is in St. Peter's Basilica. Nobody pays to get into St. Peter's Basilica. It's there for anybody in the world to go see. It belongs to everyone. And that's why the artwork of the Vatican is not valued, because it's seen by the Vatican as being held in trust for humanity. That's what it is. It's held in trust for humanity. It's not a money-producing object. It's a work of art. Now, we could debate this, but a lot of people who say the Vatican is rich, what they're talking about are these works of art. And then you have to debate, is it right to sell a work of art that was made for the glory of God? So the Vatican holds this all for the good of all humanity so that all humanity can enjoy it. So basically what ends up is you have the Vatican's net worth is about $1 billion. On that, they make a bit of return on their investments to be able to function. The city of the Vatican, about $200 million a year. The Holy See, about $200 million a year. Basically, the great majority of that money goes to pay the salaries of their 2,500 and 1,500, 2,600. So there are 4,000 employees. Most of the money goes to pay their salary. By the way, when the Pope dies, they all get a day off, a paid day off. All those people, they get a paid day off when the Pope dies. And when a new Pope gets elected, they get another day off. Isn't that nice? Well, you remember when John Paul I was elected and then he died 30 days later? And then that was 4 days off in a month. The people who run the finance of the Vatican were not amused. I want to touch on one last little thing before we take our break. This is about priest salaries. A lot of people don't know what a priest's salary is. Now, a priest's salary is determined by a diocese. And the diocese sets the rules and the regulations. The priest's salary is paid by the parishes for which the priest works, but the salary is set not by the parishes but by the diocese so that it's fair across the diocese. You'll see at the top on the right-hand column there, it's called seminarians, so we'll pass, and the transitional deacons will pass that. We'll go down then 1 to 6 years of ordination. We'll go down to 6 years and more of ordination. So now you're all going to know Father George's salary here. These are monthly salaries. Gross earnings per month is $2,593. That's per month. Okay? Which comes out to approximately $30,000 a year. That's the salary of a priest in our diocese. Now, you deduct income tax and CPP and employment insurance. They pay room and board to the parish, not a huge amount, 350 plus 125 comes out to 475 that they pay room and board to the parish. And so they end up with a check at the end of the month of $1,598. That's a priest's salary. The salaries that are paid in this diocese are pretty well average for Ontario. This is pretty much the average. So, like I say, it comes out to a salary of $30,000 a year, which is below the salary of a beginning teacher. All right? Now, for sure. Well, when I started teaching, it was my salary. I don't know what beginning salaries now are for teachers. Well, le bas de la grille maintenant, c'est quoi? I must be old. C'est à peu près 30,000, yeah. I'm not that old. Actually, it was 25. Now it's 30. But on the other hand, you have to remember, first of all, that the priest has no family. So you're just talking about himself. He gets room and board for a very, very good, for $450 a month. Nobody can get that. Get room and board. You can't get a house, an apartment. They get cable with that, but they have to buy their own TV. Yeah. Is that right, George? You have to buy your own TV? No, the parish provides the TV. Oh, geez, Timmins, they didn't provide them. We have to buy our own. See, this is what happens. Every diocese has its little quirks and quarks, Now, the Diocese of Hearst is a completely different structure. They don't have a salary. The Diocese of Hearst is the last diocese of Ontario that still goes with la dîme et la quête. Do you remember that when you used to have the envelope was divided into two parts? The priest's share and the parish's share. Well, the priest's share in the Diocese of Hearst, that's still how it works. So the priest's share is what the priest gets. So whatever the people put into that little side of the envelope, at the end of the year, that's what he gets. That's it. But in Hearst, they have a system whereby if the parish doesn't attain a certain minimum, there will be a compensation to bring the priest up to the minimum, but they pay that compensation by priests who get a lot have to contribute a certain amount past a ceiling to that fund to be able to pay the priests who have less. It's a kind of a convoluted system, but it works, I guess, in Hearst. It's been working for a while. I just want to point out that in many mission dioceses, there is no salary for a priest. The only salary a priest gets in some of these mission dioceses is the stipend for celebrating a Mass. $5 for a Mass is our stipend. So that will be it. And they're not allowed to accumulate more than one stipend a day. So $5 a day if they get the stipends. Which is a reason why, by the way, when in your parish, there are a lot of Mass stipends that have come in, and the parish priest can't celebrate them all, and he decides to send them away to the missions, you should rejoice. Because what you're doing through these Mass offerings is you're supporting a priest whose sole source of income is that $5 from the Mass that you've offered him. Anyway, it's just to tell you that there are some places of the world where the priests actually live in poverty. In the south of Italy, a young priest who's just been ordained doesn't get a full stipend of a parish priest. Most of them then have to go back and live with their parents so that they have a place to live, and their parents feed them so that they have a place to live until they can get the seniority required to be named a parish priest. And then they have a place to live of their own. But that's, in Canada, most of the places we work with a salary. It's not a huge salary, but it's a salary that we live on. What's the bishop's salary? Identical to the salary of priests. I have the same salary, okay? So I kind of laugh. I say I took a salary cut when I came here because the Diocese of Sault Ste. Marie supplied my car while I was a bishop there, but Alexandria Cornwall doesn't. I have to pay it myself. Kim? Each diocese sets its own standards. What happens among the dioceses is, there's a kind of a seeking of parity among the dioceses. So we check it out. After I arrived here, we reviewed the salaries of the priests, and we checked to make sure that we're about at parity with the rest of the dioceses of Ontario. Some dioceses a bit more, some dioceses a bit less. We have a pension fund for our priests so that when they retire, on top of their CPP, they also get a stipend. How much is it right now, George? $760 a month is what our pension fund pays to the priest. The priests and the parishes contribute to the parish fund and the priest starts receiving it when he's 65. Independently of whether he retires or not, he starts receiving that money when he's 65. Many of our priests don't retire till they're 75. So that way they can take that money and set it aside for when they actually retire and they have to get an apartment of their own or something, because then they have to find a place to live, right? And buy their own food. Okay, so the diocese, yeah, I didn't mention that. That's a good question. So the diocese, how does the diocese finance itself? It finances itself with its investment, with its investments of the 6 million, and the parishes contribute 10% of the collection, of the collections that are taken up on Sundays. 10% goes to the diocese for the functioning of the diocese. Right off the top, yeah, 10%. So 90% stays at the parish, 10% goes to the diocese for the functioning of the diocese. Thanks, I forgot to mention that. Yeah. So that's in a nutshell kind of gives you an idea of finances and the church. Let's take I went a bit over time. Let's take a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back and see if there are any questions or comments, okay? So, just already I've received a few questions, and they're interesting questions. I'll answer them quickly. Somebody asked, don't the priests get a car allowance? They used to. They used to get a car allowance separate from the salary, but now the car allowance is rolled into the salary because rules have changed for income tax purposes. Before people were allowed to get a car allowance that wasn't declared. Is that right, Gordy? Did I get that right? But they changed the rules. Now you have to specify your car allowances. You have to keep a running journal, day log, and everything. So the car allowance is rolled into the salary. So what you see is what you get there. That is the whole salary, except that there's a $300 allowance for courses once a year, an annual allowance of $300. The parish also pays the priest's annual retreat. When we go on retreat for 4 or 5 days, the parish pays that. We also have a medical plan for the priests, dental and medical and stuff like that. We have plans like that, not just for our priests, for employees. So the priests pay a bit, parish pays a bit, So and the priest gets 4 weeks of holidays, paid holidays a year. 4 weeks. So do I. So 4 weeks of holidays a year, and one day off a week. We're supposed to take 1 day off a week, whether we need it or not. So that's the living conditions of a priest in our diocese. Can a priest take an alternate employment only if the bishop assigns him to that alternate employment? For example, Father Gary Ostler also worked for the military of Canada as a regional coordinator for chaplaincy services in the military. He received a stipend for that work that he did with the military. But he can only take it if the bishop appoints him to that. It's the same thing, for example, for priests who are involved in chaplaincy work in high schools, or priests that teach. My first years, I taught high school, so I didn't take a salary from the parish where I was living. I had my salary from the school, so things like that. Somebody asked about what about religious orders, women and men. It's important that you realize that the religious orders themselves, if you notice on the page where it's written salaries, at the bottom it says the salary of a religious priest. Did you see that? And the salary of the religious priest is the sum. It's the net sum that a diocesan priest would get. It's not the gross sum and then all the income tax and everything taken off, because the religious don't pay that. Because they have a vow of poverty, they do not receive a salary. The check is made out to their name, I guess. I'm not sure. Or it's made out to the religious order. But at any rate, the money goes directly to the religious order. And the religious orders are not taxed. So the members of religious orders are not taxed in Canada. But because they're not taxed, they don't get CPP. They don't get the Canada Pension Plan when they retire. So the sisters who are working are actually bringing in the money to pay for the upkeep of the sisters who are retired, which is why right now a lot of religious orders are going through a very, very difficult time because they have very few young sisters who are working and many, many retired sisters. So this is a real problem. In Canada, it's better because of our social welfare net, but in the States, there are some religious orders, there are some sisters of religious orders who actually live in dire poverty. And the other thing is that you have to realize that some of the sisters who are working here are actually paying for the sisters who are in missionary work somewhere else, because they're not getting any money from there, right? They're not making a salary when they're working in Africa. So it's the sisters who are working in Canada who are keeping the sisters who are working in Africa alive. So there's a real kind of, in the religious orders, a real spirit of generosity and of help. So they don't own their own cars, they don't own their own clothes even. They're given a personal budget typically a year, for clothes. If they want to go on the trip, they have to ask permission. They have to get the money from the administrator, of the order. So those are the religious men and women, monks and nuns and sisters and brothers, and priests who belong to religious orders. But priests who don't, like me, diocesan priests, we're completely independent, and that's why we have to buy our own car, pay our own CPP, take care of our own retirement fund and the whole bit. So that's what happens there. Does the diocese provide the house when they retire? No. No, the diocese doesn't provide a house. I'll tell you, there's a house, Ottawa has one house for retired priests. Valleyfield doesn't. Montreal has a couple of houses for retired priests. But I asked the priests who are retired or about to retire in this diocese if they wanted me to look into getting a house where they could all live together, and absolutely not. Well, you have to realize, they've lived by themselves all their lives. All of a sudden, at the age of 70, to be thrown in with two other guys who snore, no thanks. We might pray together, but we're not going to live together. That's it's a different. No, the house belongs to the diocese. The house where I live here belongs to the diocese. So I pay room and board, just the same arrangement as the priest. Yeah, that's right. But I don't have a parish to buy the money, the food for me. So the diocese then gives me the money so I can go out buy food. So I take care of my room and board. It's like we have an arrangement. It works out. Gordy was very good when we set it up. Any other questions or comments? Yeah. Not in Ontario. Not in Ontario, because our Catholic schools are completely funded by the provincial government. Then there's no financial responsibility. At the same time, there's no managerial or supervisory responsibility. So a priest can't go into a school and say this will be taught here or things like that. In the United States, in British Columbia, Catholic schools are run either by religious orders or they are run by parishes. In the States, there are many parishes that have elementary schools. Then the school often is part of the plant. It belongs to the parish. And then the parish is responsible for making sure that school runs. So what happens is that typically they'll charge tuition fees, but the tuition fees won't cover all the expenses. So collections, the parishioners put in, they know that 3/4 of the money they're putting in is going to running that school, but they believe in the Catholic school enough that they're supporting their school. That's why the collections in the States, when you go into parishes in the States, you see collections of $30,000 a week. But you have to realize that of that 30,000, maybe 25 is going towards running that school, and only 5 is really staying with the parish. And the other thing too is, you have to remember, it's different, Canada and the States. There isn't a social safety net in the States. So for example, in the States, there's no public health like we have here, right? So a lot of parishes will hire nurses, parish nurses, to go and care for their parishioners who have no health care. And they don't have insurance and they're poor. So the parishes hire nurses. So the nurses are on the staff of the parish to take care of the people. We don't do that in Canada because you just go to the hospital if you need something. But in the States, you can't if you don't have insurance. So that's why the church in the States, the parishes in the States, are much more involved in the administration of a lot of services that here the government provides. And Catholic education being one of them for us here in Ontario. as it's a huge gift for us. Yeah, go ahead.
Does the church have in setting curriculums in school?
For the curriculum in schools is determined by the Government of Ontario, except for religious education. The Government of Ontario does not touch religious education, so it's the bishops of Ontario who set the curriculum for religious education and approve all the books that are used in the programs. I'm the chair of the commission for Ontario who does that work. So we're very much involved in that. Right now we're writing a new book for the teaching of world religions in grade 11 because we consider it part of our religious education program, so.
They have a great item in the curriculum in the Peel region where they're sending grade 11 students to Rome.
In the Peel region, some are going to Rome to subsidize. That might be, there are a lot of trips that are organized like that, and more students are taking that, and some of them are, making them into pilgrimages, which is wonderful, yeah. Many of our Catholic schools and Ontario high schools also now organize a week experience in a third world country, in the Dominican Republic. Here, St. Joseph's has been doing that for a long time. Les Stadel started doing it a few years ago. Many schools do that kind of work. Back here, yeah, Ines. Father Rory's a chaplain in the Armed Forces of Canada.
How does that work in relation with it? Is he
No, because and this, the Roman Catholic Church, because a lot of armed forces have their own chaplaincy services, have decided to take chaplains, and because the chaplains move around with the armed forces, it's hard for them to be attached to their own diocese. So Rome has organized what they call military dioceses. So they have a bishop for the Armed Forces of Canada. Bishop Thériault, Don Thériault lives in Ottawa. He's the bishop for the Armed Forces of Canada. So he has the bishop, as bishop, he's responsible for the pastoral care of all the members of the armed forces and their families in Canada. And the armed forces hire chaplains, and they hire so many Protestant chaplains and so many Catholic chaplains. Now they started hiring Jewish chaplains many years ago. Now they've started hiring Muslim chaplains. But they have so many positions for Catholic chaplains, and so Bishop Don is always looking for priests to fill those positions. Rory was interested in it. He spoke with Bishop Larocque. Bishop Larocque said, go for it. So he applied, went through officer training, and was accepted as a chaplain. And so he's now chaplain with the armed forces. I sign a contract every 5 years, saying that I'm ready to let him work for the armed forces for another 5 years, He has to retire when he turns 61. That's the rules of the armed forces. So when he's 61, he'll come back to the diocese and work in the diocese. So while he's in the armed forces, he gets his own salary from the armed forces, officer level. They get very, very good salaries, not $30,000 a year. Yes?
all these lawsuits and stuff against our diocese, all the money that you have on reserve for the various parishes, is that money that is there and available for settlements or
The lawsuits that have been launched against the diocese. You remember a few years ago there were 9 lawsuits that were launched against the diocese, and we're settling those slowly. Most of those lawsuits are covered by our insurance, so it doesn't touch diocesan money. Lawyers' fees, and settlements are covered by our insurance companies. There is one problem. There are 2 little problems. One problem is that we've been served with a new lawsuit that this guy alleges he was abused by a priest in 1952. Okay, so that's nearly 50 years ago. The priest has been dead for 30 years now. The problem is we have no records of any insurance companies insuring us before 1955. So we'll have to deal with that one by ourselves. The other problem is we have an insurance company right now that is balking at its responsibilities, so we're probably going to have to bring that insurance company to court to force them to do their responsibilities. This happens with insurance companies, folks. Anybody who's had to deal with insurance companies knows that this is the way it works. But, pardon? No, the parish monies are not off limit. Let's face it. Yes, the whole diocesan structure is at risk. Any diocese. That's why dioceses in the States had to declare bankruptcy. So. From the canon law point of view, it belongs to the parish, but from the civil law point of view, it belongs to the diocese. So if the diocese, has an obligation that the insurance companies would not cover, then we would be stuck with that. But like I say, up to now, the insurance companies have been good generally, so there's the one that we're going to have to deal with. And
what is the premium you pay a year on that?
the premium we pay a year is paid by the parishes. That's assigned to the parishes, so they're covered for fire, for explosion of boilers, for liability insurance, for malpractice insurance, and everything like that. I mean, it's a general, there's liability insurance and property insurance and accident insurance and theft insurance. So we have, the dioceses of Ontario negotiate together to get a good rate. And we have our main insurance company is an insurance company out of the States called Catholic Mutual. And so that's our main insurance company. But they're also a broker because they find other insurance companies for specific, like boiler insurance and things like that. There are companies that specialize in that. But no insurance company, for the past 4 years now, no insurance company will insure against damages arising from sexual abuse cases. That's new. And that's not just our diocese. That's nobody in North America can get that kind of insurance anymore. We were offered that kind. Last time we looked at it, and we tried. One company said, we'll offer you $1 million policy. We'll cover you for $1 million. The premium is $750,000. So that's where it is. Insurance companies do not cover that anymore. They don't. They just don't. Yeah, Gordy?
I'm just going to mention that our base, though, is covered by what they call a risk pool. That means all the parishes in Ontario have a bottom layer that's taken out of the funds themselves. So we have a better rate of insurance costs than anywhere else.
Yeah. Did everybody get that? Because the dioceses of Ontario, our first level of insurance, we're self-insured. It's a pool that all the parishes of Ontario share in that pool. So we don't touch our insurance companies until, it's like we cover for a certain deductible that we cover ourselves. Because of that, then we get really remarkable good rates for our insurance. But we have to pay into that pool, but it works out very well. We have some wonderful people who are working on these issues for us. Bishop Tonos of Hamilton, unlike me, is really good with these issues. Any final questions or comments? Yes, wait.
Just a commentary. You must love what you do.
I must love what I do?
You must love what you do for that salary.
To work for that salary? Yeah.
That goes on.
Yeah, well, nobody becomes a priest for the salary, that's for sure. It's out of love for the church and for God's word, So somebody once said, the real riches of the church anyway are the abundance of graces that flow through the body of Christ. That's the real riches of the church, yeah. Oui?
I was just wondering, when a priest leaves, let's say, to get married,
Yes.
he's still a priest.
Well, once you're ordained a priest, you're always a priest. Even if you leave the church, you're still a priest.
Still give the sacraments and everything?
Well, no, because then the rules click in that he should not give the sacraments anymore. If somebody's dying, that's the one exception, that they should, even if you left the priesthood to get married and everything, if you find yourself with somebody who's dying and they want to go to confession and nobody's around, you're supposed to listen to that confession. So that's the one exception. You hit it right on the head. Yes? Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yes. That's right. There are some priests who own cottages and houses because they've inherited money, and so they've been able to buy themselves. There's no vow of poverty. They can do that. Yeah, yeah. If they write a blockbuster novel, they can keep the money from the novel. But I'm going to want to know how many hours they spent writing that novel. But no, that's yeah. There is no vow of poverty. They can keep everything they receive. So any gift you make to a priest is made to the priest, But don't expect an income tax return income tax receipt afterwards. This is some people, they give a present to their priest and they want, well, are you going to give me an income tax? Well, no. Are you giving it to me or to the church? I'm giving it to you, Father. Well, I'm not a registered charity. The church is, so anyway. So by the way, just, I don't want to extend this. I said 8:30 and it's already 20 to 9. But, some people, they'll say, well, I'm a plumber. If I do the plumbing, in the church, for 3 hours, that would cost so much. Would you give me, I won't charge you, give me an income tax receipt instead. That's against the law. We're not allowed to do that. There are very strict laws that the government of Canada sets. We're not allowed to give income tax receipts for service in kind. That's called service in kind. We're not allowed to do that. So if you hear of somebody, it was done very, very often in the past. Very, very often in the past. But the government has started clamping down. And so we've put out, the word to our priests and our parish administrators, don't do this, So we have to abide by the laws of our country when we're dealing with each other and things like that. And one final thing is that in the laws of our country, there is no tax on a building that is used as a space of worship. So we're not taxed for this building because we celebrate Mass here every Sunday, okay? So we're not taxed for this. But the place where I live is taxed because that's not used as a place of worship. So those are all kind of rules and regulations that we have to learn to live with as a church in Canada. Okay, so anyway, I hope this has been an informative evening for you. It was meant as a kind of I hope it helps you to answer questions that you get from other people that you talk with. And the next talk next month is going to be what happened at the resurrection. So that will be more spiritual in nature. Okay? So God bless. Have a good night, everyone. Thanks for coming out. Okay? Oh! What's the date of the next one? March 4th. Thank you very much. March 4th. It'll be at the beginning of the month because the end of the month is Easter.